Melissa,
Sarah.
what are we reading today?
We're reading Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff.
So, Melissa, how autumnal would you say you are feeling right now?
How autumnal am I feeling? I would say on like a scale of, like on a scale of cozy sweater to pumpkin spice latte, I'm like a cinnamon bun candle, maybe. Like if that's the rating scale. I mean, obviously pumpkin spice latte is like the pinnacle of autumnal, so that's got to be at the peak of this measurement scale. Are you into the pumpkin spice latte? Does that do anything for you?
You know, I've resisted it over the years because I feel like there's kind of an association that I have with someone who's really into pumpkin spice everything. Um, but I can't deny when the season comes about, I will definitely enjoy myself. Maybe not a pumpkin spice latte, but definitely like a pumpkin coffee with cream and sugar and I dabble in the pumpkin spice.
It's everywhere. And actually, I remember very distinctly, like when we lived in the US, that like come Labor Day, there was just pumpkin spice everything everywhere. And there's like this defining moment that I remember actually encountering like pumpkin spice scented toilet paper in the store. Like I'm not even exaggerating. Like I was floored and I was just like, this is new levels of absurdity. Like this should not be a thing. Like I feel like if we could get pumpkin spice into the vaccines, we'd see like the anti-vaxxers would just be like, okay, you win. Like a little measles, mumps, rubella with a dash of, cinnamon, some COVID vaccine with a hint of cardamom. Like I really feel like infectious diseases would go down.
Yeah, I definitely think so as well. That's a great observation, and I do agree. I mean, it's a bit obscene, the level of pumpkin spice, and I'm not surprised at all that you found toilet paper that was pumpkin spice scented. Because yeah, it's like sometimes I'm like, this is too much. I see so much of it, and I'm like, who wants pumpkin spice toilet paper for one, but like pumpkin spice like marshmallows. Is it necessary? But maybe it is necessary when it comes to vaccines. But I guess we love a season, right? We love to we love to really fully kind of plunge ourselves into the next season and immerse ourselves in any way possible. And I think fall for a lot of people, and fall foliage, and kind of getting out your warm and fuzzy sweaters and dressing in browns and oranges and reds, like there's a whole thing. And I also think when it comes to reading, which of course that's what we're here to discuss, I think that there's definitely fall reading. I think some people maybe have certain types of books that they look for in the fall, and even just the act of reading in the fall, cozying up with a nice warm blanket and a cup of tea and or pumpkin spice latte.
Well done bringing that around.
I think I think that's a real thing. And so I guess I have a question for you is how are you adjusting to fall and your fall reading? How's that looking? And how did this book, Fates and Furies, figure into that?
Oh yeah, it was not a gift, it was lent to me. I announced that it's a gift and the person who lent it to me is like, no, I wanted that back actually. But it was lent to me, and it figured into my fall, I guess, because I was doing some kind of traveling. My kids had some away trips for sports and stuff, and I do like a good road trip read. So it was sort of that back to school kind of like, let's get back to a routine kind of read. And it was a good one. Like, I like to be able to tuck into a book that's going to really hold my attention, and this one definitely did. It's going to be a bit of a tricky one to talk about, I'm not going to lie, because it's full of sort of twisty turns, and so let this just be my blanket spoiler alert. If you plan to read this book and you're also going to listen to this conversation, you're going to maybe jeopardize some opportunity for like aha moments, because I'm just going to have to talk about some of the stuff that I know is meant to be like a bit of an exciting sort of surprise in the narrative. Or you can just hit pause, come back, go read the book, come back. That's an option too. I'll leave that to the listeners and watchers of this show to decide on their own. But it will be
And maybe we can
yeah.
even like find the moment where you give the spoiler, and we can say, skip these 10 seconds where you give the, although I suppose whatever the spoiler may be, it may end up being referenced throughout the episode afterwards.
It might be like that's how embedded into the story they are. Like because once
Okay.
the turn happens, then you're just headed down that path, and everything is sort of dependent on that twist. So I'll do my best. I'll have like a code word. Like if I say pumpkin spice, it's like heads up. This is the this is the spoiler. But it's also going to be tricky to talk about because the format itself is really not linear. It's got like a really interesting way of kind of presenting experiences, which actually I feel like is a really important part of what the message of the story is. I think that the way it's structured, that kind of floats back and forth in different time periods and then fills in gaps, I think is actually like a really important part of how the book is made, but also in how it shares its message.
So I know it may be difficult because of the nonlinear structure, but can you give some sort of a synopsis or kind of overview of what the story is and what it's about?
I'm going to do my very best. I'm going to do my very best.
Faith in you.
Thank you. Effectively, this is the story of Lotto and Mathilde. And I do want to say Lotto is short for Lancelot, which I just think is lovely.
Obviously.
Yes, it was definitely in my top 5 when I was naming Douglas the name Lancelot. No, his father's name is Gawain, so it all kind of fits.
Oh my
but
God.
yeah, I know. So it's the story of Lancelot and Mathilde. They meet in university. They fall in love very quickly, and then despite all odds and sort of the assumptions of the people around them, they actually have a really beautiful, happy, fruitful marriage until, and herein lies the first spoiler, Lotto
Pumpkin
dies.
spice.
Pumpkin spice alert.
Oh.
Lotto dies at a relatively young age. So the first section, which is the Fates section, is told up until Lotto's passing. And then the second section is the Furies section. And the first section told through Lotto's perspective. Sorry, and the first section is told through Lotto's perspective, whereas the second is through Mathilde's perspective. One thing I thought was so interesting is that when it gets to Mathilde's section, it actually almost starts over. You almost like, you even start seeing some of the same scenes and scenarios play out from her perspective, so you can sort of overlay them and see how they're so different from one another. So I really, really enjoyed how it was constructed in that way. I was thinking about it just in terms of like, we experience time. I mean, depends on who you ask, I guess. And I'm all for these, like, you know, psychedelic quantum physics, whatever's about maybe time isn't linear. But I do think that we kind of experience, at least the way we perceive it, sort of morning, noon, night, kind of linear days. But when you think about how you understand yourself and how you understand your experiences, that's not linear. And the way that I kind of understood it or conceptualized it was how we learn about ourselves in childhood. That like we're told stories about ourselves that have already happened that then inform who we are or how we understand things. And those do not get told to us in chronological order, right? We're told stories in a mixed up order that we then piece together. And then it even goes back beyond that. We hear stories about who our parents were and what experiences they had and how that informed their parenting of us. And all of this comes together to kind of determine or at least influence how we see a specific moment. And actually,
Right.
that was something that came up in the book, and I might just jump right in with a little passage because I think this will kind of inform like my reading of the book and how I felt about it. Um, so I'm going to read a little section right off the hop here. And I do want to point out two things before I read it. So one is it's kind of negative, but that's also probably telltale of like what Matilda's experience is. So you'll feel the kind of negativity in the passage. And the second part is the key word in this whole thing is the word conical. Conical. I did have to click on the Google speaker to figure out exactly how to pronounce that. It's like the adjective like related to the word cone. So it's not conical, it's
Okay.
conical. So if you picture
Okay.
a cone. Okay, so here it is. It occurred to her, and her being Mathilde, it occurred to her then that life was conical in shape, the past broadening beyond the sharp point of the lived moment. The more life you had, the more the base expanded, so that the wounds and treasons that were nearly imperceptible when they happened stretched like tiny dots on a balloon slowly blown up. A speck on the slender child grows into a gross deformity in the adult, inescapable, ragged at the edges. But this idea of if life being a cone behind you and your past gets bigger as you move forward. What lay behind you also informs what lay ahead, and that it's your past that's growing and getting wider and wider. I felt like that just encapsulated really what I got out of this book. And then also, I mean, what beautiful writing. Like, if you can say
Yeah.
nothing else about this book, she is a tremendous writer.
Well, and in preparation for this, I did, kind of look at a few reviews just to kind of get an overview of what the book was about. And so that is one thing that certainly rang true in some of the reviews that I looked at, was this sense that this is a really powerfully written book and a well-written book. And I'm interested as we get a little bit further into this discussion, to hear what your overall review is, because it definitely seemed to be a little bit on the mixed side from what I saw, but maybe that doesn't match with your experience, but it'll be interesting. And I really do like that idea of, yeah, the conical shape, and how it's describing, yeah, what kind of gets, I get, yeah, like blown up or magnified bigger, and certainly I feel like there's so much talk now about like childhood trauma and how it surfaces in adulthood. And maybe I'm like looking at that because I'm the mother of a small child, and I'm thinking about all the things that I'm doing that will someday be causing him like adult trauma. Like,
I shouldn't be laughing. I'm like, yes, exactly, and cackling. No, you're doing a great job. You got this, Mama.
yeah. Mhm. So, but yeah, I appreciate that. But I kind of want to go back a little bit, and, forgive me, but these names are very interesting. And I'm really curious about what your thoughts are on maybe the choice of names. And I want to start maybe at the beginning, because it was told initially through his perspective. But Lotto, which is such an interesting name and interesting nickname for someone who was born Lancelot. And, even just in like hearing about his name and thinking like, okay, so what are my associations with those two names, right? And so you start with Lancelot, and, certainly you're thinking of like Arthurian legend, and, like Lancelot as the stereotypical like knight in shining armor. And I don't know if that's something that like comes into play and is kind of referenced through his character and his relationship with Mathilde. But then also the idea of lotto for short, and like I can't help but think of like lottery and luck. And I'm wondering if those two things come into play. But I also just want you to talk more about Lotto as a character.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned about the luck thing too, because
Hmm.
I heard an interview with Lauren Groff, and she was like, "I kind of wish that the lottery piece wasn't part of it." But she said she almost changed it, but decided in the end not to, because she loved the name Lotto and Lancelot so much that she kept it anyway. But for me, it works because I do think it talks a lot about privilege and how that is a lot about luck, and how his sort of station in life just allows him to kind of always come out on the top of things. As far as the knight in shining armor thing, I think he would see himself that way, but then we later kind of understand that maybe that was sort of his own kind of optimism or like perception of himself. Lotto was born into a wealthy family. So his father had made a ton of money on bottled water, which I also think is really interesting, just in terms of like sort of these wealth that is, I don't know, so very based on consumption and just exploiting the
Yeah.
earth and that kind of thing. So I thought that was a really nice, deliberate choice in terms of where that wealth came from. But his father, who also dies young, when his father dies, at that point, his mother tries to kind of conserve their family wealth. So she downsizes the family into a beach house in Florida. And then at that time, Lotto, sort of as far as his mom is concerned, falls in with the wrong crowd. I read that as sort of, he's hormonal, he's 15, he's grieving and all these things, but his mom was having none of it. And so she quickly shipped him off to boarding school. He went to prep schools, then he went to Vassar, which is where he met Mathilde. And then, of course, they married so quickly, and his mother was not on board with this marriage. So she actually, isolates him from the family fortune, cuts him off from his trust fund, and he ends up living as sort of a struggling actor for many years until he eventually becomes a very successful playwright. So the majority of the story is then told as it relates to his career and sort of his adult life as a spouse to Mathilde, up until it switches perspectives into hers. There is a little passage. It's interesting because this is actually from her perspective, but I think it is a really nice way to explain him, like kind of in a nutshell. So he's asleep and she's looking at him and describing him. She says, Lotto's fists were balled up beneath his chin, and even in sleep, absent that waking wit, he was plain. The scarred skin on the cheeks, the hair still thick and swirling around his ears, the lashes, that carved jaw. She had never in her life met such an innocent. In nearly everyone who had ever lived, there was at least one small splinter of evil. There was none in him. She knew it when she saw him up on that windowsill the night before, the lightning shocking the world behind him. His eagerness, his deep kindness, these were the benefits of his privilege. This peaceful sleep of being born male and rich and white and American, and at this prosperous time when the wars that were happening were far from home. This boy told from the first moment he was born that he could do what he wanted. All he needed was to try, mess up over and over, and everyone would wait until he got it right. So it's almost like his mom called him Lancelot because she was going to make sure that he became whatever he wanted to be, whether that was a knight in shining armor or whatever it was. He was going to be different. He was going to be more powerful. But just that innocence, that naivete, sort of like wrapped up in charisma, I think it really does show his character. Like he's a big, loyal puppy dog. He's a golden retriever. That's who he is. And does he rescue her? Not really. He certainly doesn't do her any harm. She loves him and he helps her out in ways that even he's not aware. But I think it's as much this idea of his mom knowing that he'll get what he wants or he'll go far because she's going to name him as such, and the circumstances that surround his existence are going to make him successful in some way or another.
That's really interesting. And I don't know if this is a stretch, but I can't help. I don't know. You watched 30 Rock, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like you must have. Yeah. So there's an episode where John Hamm guest stars and he goes out on a date or maybe multiple dates with Liz Lemon, Tina Fey's character. And he is gorgeous because he's John Hamm. I mean, come on. But he's also like terrible at everything. But because he's so good looking and because he's a white male, um, everybody just kind of gives him a pass. Like he was terrible at playing tennis and he's like trying to teach her how to play tennis. And she's just like, he's terrible at this. Like, what's going on? And he's just like oblivious to the whole thing. He's had this privilege of being a good looking man. And so therefore, like within access of a certain amount of like just given power. And I don't know, for some reason, like as you were reading that and as you were describing him, I'm like, oh my God, I'm picturing him as John Hamm in 30 Rock.
I totally remember that episode. And they go to a restaurant and he orders off the menu and she's like, they're never going to let you order off the menu. And they were like, right away, sir. Like everyone was just bending over backwards for him. That is kind of a good comparison, actually. And especially because of the way the story is constructed, that when it comes into Matilda's section, that when she goes back to the beginning and all of these stories start to overlay, we do realize he wasn't as much of an overnight success as he thought he was. So what ends up happening is he's an actor for a large part, but like he's an actor early in his career after graduation, but he's doing not very well with it. And Matilda's got a lot more on the line because she doesn't come from wealth, and we come to find out later, this is also a spoiler, pumpkin spice alert, she marries him for his money, even though that's not how it's presented from his perspective. And ultimately, they get cut off from the family wealth, so she doesn't really benefit from it right away anyway. And on New Year's Eve of 1999, he apparently, in some sort of drunken inspiration, writes an entire play. He writes a full script. And as he recounts it, he wakes up and Matilda goes, oh my gosh, we're starting this new millennium and it turns out you should have never been an actor. You should have been a playwright. You just wrote this most amazing play. But then when she tells the story, it's like he had sort of like his loose autobiography that he had written in a play format, and she was the one sort of behind the scenes turning it into what eventually led him to become incredibly successful. As we keep reading, there's all kinds of little moments where, the golden retriever's like, I can't believe this is going so well for me. And meanwhile, everyone's like, yeah, no, people were bankrolling that. People were influencing this and that, like to get him to where he was. So, but she's motivated to make sure he's successful because she's got a very troubled past. And earlier we were joking about childhood trauma. This is not a
but
funny
she's
joke.
got it, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I found like a few contact points with her and other characters that you and I are both familiar with. So
Right.
she loses a child. No, sorry, she loses a sibling. I'm so sorry. She loses a sibling at a very young age. Like the sibling is like a toddler, and I think she's sort of like a primary schooler. Which obviously turns her family life upside down. And it reminded me so much of, is it William Waters or William Walters in Hello, Beautiful?
Well, I definitely
husband.
know it's William.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I can totally see that because, yeah, very similar, like loses a sibling, home life completely falls apart, and he becomes like
she's like estranged basically from her family, which is ultimately what happened to him. And he gravitated to another family, which is more or less what she does as well. And then obviously she has extremely complex, understandings of motherhood and does not wish to be a mother. This is a major spoiler, so just mute for the next 15 seconds for sure if you don't want to hear this one. She has her tubes tied, like she willingly does that to ensure that she will not become a mother, even though Lotto is insistent on having a family with her. Just waiting for the 15 seconds in case anyone's going to tune back in. It's probably about now. But that reminded me of I think it's the opening scene in The Spectacular, when the main character there has that experience where she's in in particular.
Well, she's requesting it and she's being denied.
Yes,
because they're telling her she's too young and she's going to want this one day.
Yeah. And a similar conversation happens, but obviously to differing results. And then the only other another character, and this is interesting because this is how I came to have the book lent to me, not gifted, is because she's a little bit like Cleo in Frankenstein and Cleopatra. And so the friend who I had loaned that book to, which we talked about in our last Rogers episode, she was reading it, and because they host all these really fancy parties and they're very glamorous and elegant, and of course Matilda is always described in the Lotto sections as very pure and loving and beautiful. And as a woman reading that, I couldn't help but be like, yeah, but what's she really like? So again, the sort of connection point with Cleopatra there too. So there was she's an enigma for sure. Her past is very complex. But she sort of resembles or has some kind of connections or echoes with like some other well-known kind of, I don't want to say tropes, but like some familiar type characters for sure.
Well, and I feel like this kind of a story, like the story that's told from differing perspectives, two people in a relationship, is one that we end up seeing, you know, commonly. And I can't help but think of Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, for example. Like that, I mean, I feel like that's like in modern storytelling one of the most which I'm not sure if you read that or not, but no, and it was huge, zeitgeisty, you know, book in the what mid aughts or whatever. But that definitely was a couple, and you see the two people's perspectives and the fact that they're both hiding things from each other, or they don't realize who the other person really is, and that certainly is a very dark story. But so I can see how you would find parallels between certain characters or elements of these characters' lives in other books that you know that you've read. So um no, I think it sounds like a pretty interesting read. And you enjoyed the fact that it was nonlinear. Like, did it feel like a little bit of a puzzle that you were kind of putting together slowly as the book went on?
That's an interesting way of putting it. I don't know that I felt like it was a puzzle. Like, but I did definitely feel it kind of like coming together. Like one of the words when I was even kind of thinking about like how was I going to talk about this book, how was I going to describe it, and one of the words I kept coming back to was full. Like it felt like a full book. It didn't feel like overwhelming. It felt full. Like there were never passages where I was like, what is the point to this? Like why this should be cut? Like everything really felt like it had its place. And it was just so artfully and poetically constructed that it never felt jarring. It felt like it flowed nicely to tell the story that it set out to tell. I listened to some of her like descriptions of her writing practice though too, and it sounds like, again, I'm not a writer, so I really can't like comment on it, but like according to her own account, she'll like basically write the book and then scrap it. Like it's like she has to put together a rough draft, start to finish, like everything in between, and then she destroys that version of it, that draft, so that she's not bound to it when she recreates it for her second draft, and that's the one that she'll go by. That like the first attempt is just about creating that skeleton. And when I heard that, I was like, that kind of makes sense because like it was just the bones of the book were so solid. And it was fun too because not only was the reading like, you know, turning the page was that is a linear practice, but that what I found wasn't linear, that my physical process of reading was not linear because inevitably when I would read a scene that I knew I had seen before, I'd be like flicking back to try to find it so I could read it again. And it was just full of like Easter eggs. Because if I hadn't gone back and looked, I wouldn't have realized like, oh, I can't believe that phrasing was so referencing what would come later. So it was really like, it was kind of disjointed in the sense that I would flick back and flick forward. And it was like impossible to find the sections because it's not linear. So I'd be more like going by like, where was I reading that? Was that when I was in the car? Was that when I was on the deck? Like I'd have to go in like my own reading sitting to figure out how to actually find it because the book was like so so out of order in terms of how it was put together.
I mean, it sounds like an exciting read, like just an exciting act of reading. And I love having to flip back and reference something that happened before that I read before, just to kind of like, yeah, like these little aha moments of like, oh yeah, oh, that's different. Or yeah. And wow, I like just thinking about the way that she structures and writes books. Like, I feel like that's I can totally understand that it would be a way to kind of make a strong story, but at the same time, like the idea of like writing a whole first like draft and then trashing it like sounds a little painful to me.
I
Like,
know, I kind of didn't buy it. I was like, in this age of digital, I was like, it's not like she had like her quill and then tossed it in her fire. Like, I'm like, I think you maybe just saved it on like a backup hard drive. You definitely did not just like totally destroy it. But
yeah, you just went through like the cursor and just like erased the whole thing. That's that. Burned
Don't
the
believe it.
computer and then started over fresh. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, I'm also thinking of another not a store not a book, but there was a television show which was on Showtime here in the United States, and it was probably like back in like maybe like 2015 that it came out, and it was called The Affair, and it was told through the two people who end up being involved in the affair. It's through their both of their perspectives, but like each episode, the first half would be everything in his perspective, and then the second half would go back to the beginning, and it would be the same things that happened, but it would be through her perspective. The show, as with all Showtime shows, ended up going totally off the rails, like starting in the second season, which I feel like is such a trademark of a Showtime show. But the first season was excellent, and I found that kind of storytelling like riveting, because it did really kind of keep you on your toes and keep you engaged and keep you really aware and like paying attention to what's happening, because
I
you're
think
trying
if
like where are these like two perspectives totally disjointed from one another. I don't know.
And I think that if I had known that it was going to shift perspectives in the way that it did, I might have maybe read certain things a little bit more closely. And I feel like I'm such a one-trick pony when it comes to like any kind of like references. Like I have such a limited bank that I can draw on because. But so when you referenced 30 Rock, and I was like, I know this one. I truly do. But this is like, again, I'm referencing Arrested Development, as I always do. But remember when they did the reboots, and like it was very clear that the reason why they structured like the reboot seasons in the way they did was because of scheduling. Like they couldn't get
Right.
Jason Bateman and Portia, what's her name? Portia de Rossi?
The Rossi.
Like, they couldn't get all those people in the same room at the same time to film together. So they came up with this way of like, oh, they'll all meet, it'll all be from that police station, and then they'll follow one at a time. It kind of reminded me of that. But the other part of this book that reminded me of Arrested Development was, again, this very beautiful poetic writing style that she would insert these square bracket portions in the text. So it was almost like I was calling it a sub-narrator, but what I really meant was it reminded me of a voiceover. So, like when you're watching Arrested Development and then like something will happen and then his voice chimes in and he's like, actually, it was such and such. I think I have like an example.
Yes.
Okay, I hope this like can come through, like in reading it.
It's like there's like a narrator is popping in and telling you what's really going on, or like kind of correcting, and like the like almost like this little omniscient voice that's just
And they're
picking on
very
here and
brief, like they're so pointed, like they don't drone on, it's like a phrase or two. Like in this one, so as I said, he was super wealthy, and so he was like going into this place and this particular room. It said, he who all his life had walked everywhere in the sultry heat as if he had owned the place. He had owned the place. Felt his shoulders pressed to his ears as he scuttled over the cold, hard ground. So it's just like these little quips. And so I was like seeing it as, this voiceover situation. I was like totally thinking of it in terms of like how it would look in a modern context. And then apparently this is a trope in Greek mythology, not a trope, I don't know, a writing strategy, I don't know what the right word would be, in Greek mythology. She's meant to reference the chorus there. And I was like, I really missed that.
Which ultimately makes sense, especially with a book that's titled Fates and Furies, because that's definitely an element of Greek mythology. Like not that I'm like an expert, and I'm sure the experts that will undoubtedly be watching this will be like, you're wrong. You don't know anything about Greek mythology. And they are right. I don't.
They are right.
But I know the concept of like the fates is like the three women, maybe sisters again. And like the idea that they all have a role, and it's like having to do with like literally like fate, like you are fated to live a certain life. And like, it's all done through like a loom. So one is like, I guess, weaving some sort of a thread, weaving a thread, and the other one is measuring the thread, and the third one cuts the thread, and that's supposed to be your life. right? That's like the three element. That's so that those are the fates. And then
There's a
I
whole thing
believe,
about this in there. See, this is good. Okay, keep going. Sorry, that
yes.
is like very explicitly referenced in the book. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
And then the Furies is basically like the punishment. Like, I don't know, like, I guess whatever out there is judging you and doling out punishments. And so, and you said that like there's the Fates section, which is Lotto's section, right? And then the Furies section, which is Matilda's section. So but that I know that that is, you know, a very strong element of Greek mythology, Fates and Furies, and then the idea of a Greek chorus of like, yeah, like this, I guess, omniscient voice, like I said, just kind of piping in and, you know, kind of making a statement or a comment. And it is also like a huge feature of like Shakespearean plays. Like there are Greek choruses in Shakespearean and Elizabethan plays as well. So
I actually
just
found it kind of funny, and you and I always like often end up talking about the acknowledgments. And at one point, she's like, "And I'd like to thank William Shakespeare for influencing my writing style." I was like, "Oh yeah, just
yeah,
William Shakespeare." Like it just
yeah,
seemed
of
like a
course.
really funny reference in the
Yeah,
acknowledgments.
yeah, and I'm sure he's up there somewhere and saying like, "Hmm, you're welcome."
Finally, someone
Yeah.
acknowledging me and my prowess.
Recognition. I mean, me
Yeah.
old Billy Shakespeare. Yeah.
Well, and
Um,
Lotto is a playwright too, and I think he sort of like
uh,
sees himself in this kind of way. So, anyway.
well, and I'm wondering too, like the idea of like this is like that maybe ultimately the whole thing is like a meta commentary, right? So he's an actor and he's also a playwright, and even some of these elements that she's bringing in from, you know, from the theater, but then also like the performance, like that the performance within this relationship, that they were both playing roles at certain points, maybe, I don't know.
Oh yeah, I think for sure. I think, and I mean, again, spoiler, like obviously Mathilde was not born Mathilde. You know, she does absolutely take on an entire new, like, again,
Persona.
yeah, like she, John Hamm, she John Drapers herself, if you will, sort of. Well, no, that's not a really good comparison, to be fair. But in any case, yeah, like she's definitely performing something. Yeah, there's versions
Mhm.
of her that Lotto doesn't know, and she sort of vows at certain points that he never will know. But so there's definitely a connection point to performance there, for sure.
Mm. Well, Melissa, I mean, this sounds like a fascinating book. And I think it might be time for me to ask you the question that we always ask on this podcast, which is drum roll, please.
maybe,
Melissa,
maybe we'll get a little sound effect put in there instead of me just gurgling. Sorry, go ahead.
you
Yes.
did really great drum. I really appreciated it for one. But Melissa, would you say that the Fates or Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff is a could read, a should read, or a must read?
I am going to say that Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff is a must read. And I'm so happy to give it a must
Nice.
read. It
You
was
don't give
really
a
good.
ton of must reads. I feel like, you know,
Yep,
those are precious to you. So I
absolutely.
appreciate
I do not dole out the must read with you know any careless abandon. It is a must read because even as we're talking about it right now, I'm finding more things that I love about it. Like it's inspiring me to go back and find some more passages. Like when you talked about the threads, and I was like, oh my gosh, this book is all the more brilliant than I was even thinking it was. I really enjoyed like considering the book after I finished reading it and reading the reviews and thinking about what I was going to say in this conversation. I mean, obviously, I don't know yet how long this book will stay with me and how long it'll percolate in my mind. And that's always one of those things we talk about that really determines, you know, the could read, should read, must read categorizations. But not only was it a great story, not only was it interesting, and I thought just that I loved the structure, I loved the story, I loved what she was trying to do, I loved the pacing. at the very crux of it all, I really liked her writing. Like, I think there's no denying that even at a sentence level, this is a beautiful book that's worth reading. So, highly recommended. I mean, frankly, I've done so many spoilers at this point. People are not going to feel like they need to read the book because I've
They
told them
already
a lot about
read
it. But still worthwhile reading. I would give Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff a must read.
Well, excellent, Melissa. And maybe you'll read other books of hers too. Maybe they'll end up popping onto this podcast at some point as well. Because I do know people referenced the first book that she read, which did I write it down? Do I know what the title is? No, but
I think it's
about how well
Arcadia.
written and how excellent of a book that was, and
Mm.
that's what prompted them to read Fates and Furies. So, yeah, maybe that'll be she'll be an author that comes in here more than once.
I feel like I'm a little bit like late to the game with this one. I think that it must have been like wildly popular in 2015-ish, and it never came across my radar at that point. But also, just sort of hearkening back to our last Rogers episode, I did understand the assignment, and I picked
You
up all
did.
fours as per your homework
Yeah.
assignment for this term. So I don't think that's the next thing I'm going to read because I want to leave it till a little bit closer to when we actually talk about it in the December holiday roundup episode or year-end roundup episode. But I do have it in my possession, and I'm excited to dip into this one. You've read it already, though. So,
Well,
but
I
no
have read it.
spoilers.
Believe me, I will give you no spoilers, but I am very, very curious to see what your response will be to this book. And that's all I'll say about that.
So great to see you. Thank you for this conversation.
Yes, thank you. This was a blast as always. And again, we just want to give a shout out to Rogers Cornerbrook for working with us on these visual podcasts and episodes. And for those of you who are just tuning in, look for us. Could read, should read, must read on Instagram, on Facebook, and you can listen to us because we do have more episodes that we have recorded and more episodes to come. But until next time, my friend.
Until next time, bye.
Bye.